Hello, everyone. Here we are on our Introduction to the Christian Scriptures, Week 3. We just finished the book of Genesis, and now we're going to dive into the rest of the Pentateuch. The Pentateuch is the 5 books that compose the first part of the Old Testament Bible, or the Torah. That would be Genesis, Exodus, Numbers, Leviticus, and Deuteronomy. And so we finished our discussion of Genesis, so now let's jump in to the rest of the Pentateuch. Thank you very much. We are taking our material from Arterbury, Bellinger, and Dodson, Engaging the Christian Scriptures, published in 2021, and we are in Chapter 2, beginning in pages 45 through 67. We're going to go through all this week, but it may take 2 videos to cover this material. We'll do the best we can. So here is our outline for today, or at least as much as we can get through today. The composition of the Pentateuch, which talks about the books of Moses, the documentary hypothesis, and some alternatives to it. The Exodus and the Covenant, which deals with the story of Moses, the struggle in Egypt, the divine name, the history and faith, and the covenant at Sinai, which is where we might pause this video to continue next time. Then the next section we will deal with the sojourn in the wilderness, which is covered in the book of Numbers. We'll talk about the route of the Exodus. We'll talk about the book of Deuteronomy and the influence of Deuteronomy, and then we'll close with a theological reflection. So, the composition of the Pentateuch over our journey through the book of Genesis has provided us enough background to pause and consider the question of how the first 5 books of the Old Testament, or the Pentateuch, or the Torah, came to be. This issue has been a major subject in biblical studies. The books of Moses. The tradition has tied the first 5 books of the Bible to Moses, a tradition that has been interpreted in some circles to suggest Mosaic authorship. These books pass on the faith centered on the Mosaic covenant, but they nowhere explicitly claim that Moses was the author. They actually are anonymous. Some of the indications of the anonymity of the authorship of these 5 books are found in, for example, Genesis 12:6. There's a note that says, at that time the Canaanites were in the land, which, if it had been written by Moses, would have not made sense, because the writer seems to be writing from a time when Canaanites were gone. Genesis 36:31 reads, these are the kings who reigned in the land of Edom before any king reigned over the Israelites. And obviously Moses was not around with the installation of the Davidic monarchy or Saul, and so that comment would not make sense if it had been written by Moses. The conclusion of the book of Deuteronomy also comes after the death of Moses, so obviously someone else had to finish it up. So most likely the actual editors and authors of the first 5 books of the Bible are anonymous. The documentary hypothesis was put forward in the 17th century by those who study the biblical books, who suggested from time to time that some composition of these books came after the time of Moses. So this hypothesis arose in the 17th century, in which scholars began to develop a number of hypotheses to explain how the books originated. In that era, scholars often questioned traditional views in the context of the historical studies or ancient cultures. And the view that came to dominate the discussion was called the documentary hypothesis, the theory that the Pentateuch developed from a combination of several documents. So here's a graphic representation of this hypothesis. You see at the upper left at the top, J was in the 10th century. J is a posited source or editor, standing for Yahweh or Jehovah. 10th century BCE. E is at the 9th century BCE. I'll explain what E is in a moment. D was in the 7th century BCE, around the time of the King Josiah. And P is in the 6th century BCE. And the idea is that all of these different sources and editors contributed to the final form of the Torah. And here we have Pentateuchal traditions. J is for Yahwist. This was the earliest, this is posited as the earliest editor. This author or editor uses Yahweh, the tetragrammaton, the 4 letters of the holy name of God. He writes in a vivid, concrete style. He's a storyteller, begins with creation, uses the term Mount Sinai for the place where the Mosaic covenant was concluded, and seems to be related to the southern kingdom of Judah and has a hopeful tone. The next author or editor is E, the Elohist. This author uses Elohim for God. The style is more abstract and less picturesque than J's. Uses the term Horeb or Mount Horeb for the covenant mountain. Begins the story with Abraham, related to the northern Israel kingdom, which is Ephraim, the tribe of Ephraim, and it has a prophetic tone. D, the Deuteronomist, reflects the literary style and religious attitudes of Josiah's reform, which was around 621 BCE. Insists that the only one of the central sanctuary is acceptable to Yahweh. Composed possibly in the north, related to the former prophets, seems to espouse covenant theology. And finally, P, or the priestly source, emphasizes priestly concerns, law, worship aspects of religion, has a precise writing style, lists censuses and genealogies, and is derived from the priestly preservation of Mosaic traditions in the Babylonian exile. So this is the theory, the documentary hypothesis, which is not as popular today as it was 50 or 60 years ago. Some interpreters do not think the search for compositional sources of the Pentateuch will succeed. Others prefer an approach that emphasizes the final text of the books rather than the hypothetical original sources or traditions as the basis of interpretation. These interpreters focus on the literary forms or the patterns in the final shape of the text. They may be called form critics or rhetorical critics. Again, the word critic here doesn't mean a crabby, bitter person who's criticizing. It's talking about critical thinking or an approach to critical analysis. The crabby person would be me. Just kidding. There is something to say for old grouches. The approach of this textbook, the author makes a statement. I don't recall what page it is on. Around page 57. No, it's in the 50, somewhere in the 50s. I don't have the page number right now, but the author points out that they plan to take a holistic approach in this book that attends both to the questions of origin, but not exclusively. They will also attend to questions of the shape of the final text in the Pentateuch. This approach will typify this textbook or volume. Historical questions of origin will come into play when they have a reasonable basis that can help with the interpretation, but the whole book is not going to be dominated by a historical critical approach, which is good. I think it's a nice balance. So the summary for this first section is that the first 5 books of the Bible are traditionally labeled the books of Moses because they pass on to readers the authoritative Mosaic faith, not because Moses was the actual author of the books. Moses is the fountainhead of the covenant faith established in Exodus. The image of the Pentateuch as a river fed by tributaries is a helpful one. The various traditions contribute to the whole. So you have a river that keeps getting larger and wider and broader, and along the way, numerous tributaries are feeding into that river. The other helpful image is the memory of a people. The Pentateuch is the record of the memories of the descendants of Abraham, the community of faith. So some of the major themes in the Pentateuch. The Torah derives from a process that has brought together a variety of traditions to compose this first section of the Bible. So some of the major themes of the Pentateuch include the ancestral covenant promise, going all the way back to Abraham. After the Tower of Babel, Abraham is called to go on a journey, and he's given an ancestral covenant promise that gets reaffirmed in every generation. Another theme is creation. God is creator. Another one is the call for faithfulness, the call for the people of God to be faithful to the covenant between God and the people. And finally, the Mosaic covenant, which takes place on Mount Sinai or Mount Horeb in some versions, which is a divine theophany. It's called the ultimate theophany because God comes down on the top of a mountain in an overwhelming way, not just in a burning bush or in a ram caught in a thicket, but in a major theophany. Theophany meaning an appearance of the divine. So now let's talk about Exodus. Exodus in context. Exodus begins with the creation of the people of God and moves toward the fulfillment of the ancestral covenant promise. The story of Joseph is often related to the reign of the Hyksos, which were a Semitic group which invaded and ruled over Egypt from 1700 BCE to 1550, the Hyksos. The Amarna Age was named after a new capital city that was built during a time of radical change by Pharaoh Akhenaten. I don't know if I'm pronouncing that right. Akhenaten. In the 4th century BCE, the 14th century BCE, this pharaoh also came up with the idea of a monotheistic religion based on worship of the sun. Letters document the activities of the Habiru, which is a very close word to Hebrew. Let me show you some of these words. So you see here, there are letters documenting a people, an ethnic group called the Habiru, which sounded in the description a lot like Hebrews. So it's not close enough to be exactly historical evidence, but maybe, and it's not historical proof, but maybe some possible evidence suggestive. While there are not explicit Egyptian records recounting the Hebrew story of the Exodus, the biblical account fits with what we know of Egyptian history and culture, particularly in this 14th century period. The story of Moses. Exodus 2 introduces Moses, the one who will lead the Hebrew people out of Egyptian bondage. I couldn't resist using a photo, a rendering of Charlton Heston. In my generation, he was the classic icon of Moses in the movie The Ten Commandments. It's a great movie. I hope you'll get a chance to watch it. So he is born and he's preserved in the midst of oppression. He's given an Egyptian name in Exodus 2:10, and he grows up in Pharaoh's court with all of its advantages. He was a Hebrew, but if you remember the story, the Hebrew male babies were to be killed by being placed in the water and drowned in the river Nile. His mother had pity on him and didn't want him to die as any mother would. So she made a basket of reeds and put him in the basket so he floated down the river, where he was discovered by Pharaoh's daughter. And Moses' sister came running up and said, "Do you want me to find a wet nurse from among the Hebrews to help you take care of this child?" So Moses is adopted by Pharaoh's daughter and is raised as one of the court of the pharaonic court of Egypt. tetragra tetragrammaton. That's how you pronounce that word. So the divine name. It is in the context of this theophany that the divine name Yahweh is revealed in Exodus 3. The name is at times called the tetragrammaton because it is composed of 4 letters, Y, H, W, and H. This was because the name was so holy that ancient Israel refused to pronounce the name or say it. They came to the practice of not pronouncing it or writing out the whole name. So they just eliminated all the vowels. So it's unpronounceable. YHWH. But modern scholars have concluded that it likely was something like Yahweh was the name. Among German scholarship with the German language and the German spelling, it came out as Jehovah. And that's where the King James Version of the Bible gets Jehovah as the name, or Yahweh, the Tetragrammaton. It's the divine name, it's the given name of God. It's not his title, it's not his position or office. It's not like the word God, which is more like an office or a position. It's the specific given name of God, which in most translations in English is translated Lord. The Lord your God would be Yahweh Elohim. So this brings us to the Passover Festival. I'm jumping over quite a bit of the story here of the confrontation between Moses and his brother Aaron as a spokesperson, confronting with the priests of the Egyptian religion and Pharaoh, demanding that they let the people go. The Hebrew people were in bondage as slaves, being forced to work in a cruel and unjust fashion. And there's a whole process of 10 plagues that are unleashed on Israel. I don't know if I have those further on in this. I don't think I put them in here. Sorry, I jumped over that. But there are 10 plagues. Each one of the plagues are aimed against a specific Egyptian deity. At one point, there's darkness over all of Egypt, which is a direct confrontation with the solar god Ra of Egypt. And eventually, as a result of these confrontations, the last one is the death of the firstborn children throughout Egypt. And that's a direct attack against Ptah, the creator god, the giver of life. And Moses warns Pharaoh that the firstborn children would be killed. And then Moses goes to the Hebrews and tells them to eat a Passover meal and to sacrifice a lamb and to apply the blood of the sacrificial lamb to the doorposts of the house, so that the angel would see the blood and pass them by, would pass over, and not harm the children of that household. Of course, the Egyptians didn't do this, and so all the Egyptian firstborn male children died, including the firstborn son of Pharaoh. So the Passover meal was instituted so that future generations will remember the story of how Yahweh spared the Hebrews in the death of the firstborn and liberated them from Egyptian oppression. In all this story, there's a prominent role for human and specifically female leadership. Of course, you have the leadership of Moses. Because he's hesitant about his speaking ability, God calls Aaron, his brother, to assist him as in a priestly prophetic role. And his sister Miriam is another actor in this drama. The God who delivers, Yahweh of Israel, brings the Hebrews out of oppression and creates a people through mighty acts of leadership of Moses, Aaron, and Miriam. It's worth noting that women play an essential part in this movement of the Exodus narrative as well, and that human and female leadership are essential. God is not bypassing human agency and snapping his fingers and doing all this. He's doing it through Moses, through Aaron, through Miriam, the Hebrew midwives, Shiphrah and Puah, Moses' mother, his sister Miriam, of course, as already mentioned, Pharaoh's daughter, Moses' wife Zipporah, the leader Miriam, his sister, also called a prophet or prophetess. All of these people are instrumental in the deliverance of the Hebrew slaves out of bondage. The narrative seems uninterested in human questions of causation, but centers on the mighty acts that accomplish the announced purposes of the Hebrew God Yahweh. Readers of these narratives will understand that while the Egyptians saw frogs on the ground, the eyes of faith see a mighty act that contributes to the purpose of divine liberation of the oppressed Hebrews. Some have attempted to date the Exodus from Egypt in the 15th century BCE, but the consensus among scholars is that the events likely come in the 13th century BCE during the time of Pharaoh Ramses II. The picture of Canaan derived from the ancient Near Eastern texts and we know of the Egyptian history is from that time suggests the 13th century, also known as the Amarna period. The covenant at Sinai, the liberation from Egypt eventually leads to the defining theophany in the Hebrew scriptures, the encounter of Yahweh with Israel at Mount Sinai, leading to a covenant relationship. This is where God comes down and encounters the entire people that he's calling to be his people. Exodus 19 summarizes the narrative. Moses leads the people to prepare to encounter Yahweh, whose presence is symbolized with trumpet sound, thunder, lightning, smoke, and fire. Very dramatic. From Sinai, Yahweh reveals the shape of life for this community. Exodus 20 presents the familiar 10 Commandments, or the Decalogue, or the 10 words, central to the shape of Old Testament faith. I found a nice picture on the internet that kind of dramatizes this idea of a definitive theophany or an appearance of the divine to over 1 million people at one time. And here's the iconic Charlton Heston in his role as Moses with the stone tablets. Moses went up to the mountain and encountered the theophany with Yahweh, and a whole lot more happens by the way. He asks to see God's face. God tells him he can't see his face, but he will cover him in a rock in a cleft and pass by and let him see him from behind. And God also identifies him as his glory, as his goodness, his mercy, his loving kindness is his glory. All of this happens on the mountain. Moses comes down from the mountain prematurely gray. I mean, he's already well over 80 years old, so maybe we shouldn't say prematurely, but he suddenly is completely gray and white from having been face to face, so to speak, with the divine. He's given the Decalogue, or the 10 Commandments, written by God's finger in stone. And here is a listing of the 10 Commandments from the book: the worship of God or Yahweh only, prohibition of images that give a fixed point of contact with the deity. There's a lot we can say about that. There's something similar in Islam, by the way, where they're not allowed to, and it comes from the Decalogue, they do not allow the painting or the rendering of human or animal figures. The prohibition of the use of the name of Yahweh and spells supporting evil. Don't use my name in vain. Setting aside the Sabbath for worship and rest. Supporting aging parents and the extended family. Honor thy father and mother. The prohibition of premeditated murder in the context of a blood vengeance society. The prohibition of adultery, of stealing, of perjury in the legal system, and prohibition of coveting what others have. This is are the Ten Commandments. And when you compare them to other legal systems of the time, the Code of Hammurabi actually pre-existed the Hebrew Ten Commandments. The Assyrian law codes were extremely strict, moderated somewhat by the Babylonian law codes. The Code of Hammurabi was the Babylonian version. The story of Emperor Hammurabi has some parallels to that of Moses. The author points out Israel's codes seem to center more on the sacredness of life than some of the other ancient Near Eastern law codes, perhaps reflecting traditions of Yahweh as the creator of life, and also the dignity of human life made in the image of God. The author points out that the revelation of Sinai consists of two types of law, apodictic and casuistic. Apodictic is a basic universal statement, thou shalt not kill, period, end of discussion. Casuistic has to do with causality. If you do this, then this will happen. So you choose. But if you mess around and you do this, then bad stuff will happen. That's a different kind of approach to the law. So I think we're going to pause here, and halfway through this section on the Pentateuch, and I will continue with where this is the book of Exodus we've discussed. We'll continue in our next session this week on Leviticus, Numbers, Leviticus, and Deuteronomy. Give, of course, very brief overviews of each one before we move on to the former prophets. And thank you very much for your time and attention. This is part 1 of week 3, and we shall continue. Thank you.